In the 1960s, I was a young kid in north of here in a little town called Guadalupe. I was the 9th of 11 children, and my mother would come and get us up very early, and I would put on my work clothes and my rubber overalls and my rubber boots, and we would all pile into the station wagon and head for the fields in the local area in Santa Barbara County. Now, I worked in cauliflower fields, and it was my job to put the rubber bands around the cauliflower plants to keep the cauliflower head from turning yellow and make them unmarketable. And as you can imagine, the fields were cold and wet first thing in the morning, and the plants were big gray plants with dew all over them, and so when you bent down to put the rubber band on them, you were sopping wet very quickly. And it was cold, it was wet, and as you're sloshing through the mud many times a day, my boots would get pulled off my feet. And there's nothing worse than standing in mud and having your boot left behind. I grew up in Guadalupe, a small farm town on the Central Coast, halfway between Big Sur and Santa Barbara. And my mother and father were farm workers. My father was a native Spanish speaker, and my mother was a native English speaker, born and raised in Nebraska. But my mother learned Spanish very quickly so that they could speak to each other, and that's a whole other story. But they communicated, and she learned to communicate with him for the next 60 years. We harvested cauliflower, strawberries, bell peppers, broccoli, and string beans. And at that time, just over 3,000 people lived in Guadalupe, where I grew up, and the average annual household income was about $8,000 per household. One day when I was working in a cauliflower field with my family next to Highway 1, I looked up and we saw this parade of workers and red flags with these black eagles emblazoned on them. Now think about this. I'm a teenager with my family and we're all working in the fields, and I didn't quite understand what was going on and what that meant. My parents didn't really like those marchers because they were radicals and they were going to disrupt our work. So we kept our heads down and we continued to work in the dirt and the mud. But as many of you, school was my refuge. Kindergarten with Mrs. Negrich was a warm, clean, safe place where I got to trade my rubber boots for school clothes and a library card. It was where I got to read and play with other children. And probably similar to many of your stories, my teachers were my role models and other authority figures in my life. My high school ag teacher, Del Clement, would drive 10 miles from Santa Maria to Guadalupe to pick me up so that I could go on a field trip. I needed a white shirt so I could compete with the Future Farmers of America, and he took me to J.C. Penney, and he bought me a white shirt. And Del did what you all do every day. You see the potential in a student, and nothing stands in your way to help them. And like many of you, I took a number of occupational interest surveys in school. Of course, for me, social worker, priest, and teacher would come up. Well, as many of you know, I'm gay, so priest didn't seem like a good option at the time. But also, or not, I still didn't choose that pathway. But being gay in a little farm town also meant that the closet and me would be very good friends for a very long time. And as Mr. Clement was just the mom, he is who convinced me that I could be the first person in my family to go to college. And in 1971, I packed up my blue Ford Galaxy 500, woohoo, and drove from Guadalupe to Cal Poly to become a teacher. In 1975, I returned home to teach at Righetti High School in Santa Maria alongside my mentor, Del Clement. And during some contentious contract negotiations with our district, I was asked by my fellow teachers to attend and speak on behalf of our program. I spoke, and an interesting thing happened. I made the school president cry. Now, that was not my intent at all. But I learned a very valuable lesson about collective action and the power of information and data delivered with passion. And that night, a union site rep was born. I served as president of the Santa Maria High School District Faculty Association, and in February 1990, I led our union in a month-long strike. With a shared understanding of those red flags and black eagles, we harnessed the collective power of over 90% of our teachers to stand together for that month to fight for our core values that translated into a successful contract and the recall of 3 sitting board members. In 1995, I began my career with CTA, first as a primary contact staff in Stockton, California, then as a legislative advocate in Sacramento. I served as the manager of Region 2 and for 10 years as the Associate Executive Director for Governmental Relations. And as you know, for the last 2 years, I've served as your Executive Director. And remember that closet I mentioned earlier? Well, CTA's commitment to social justice and LGBTQ values are its core values. And in 1995, when we moved to Stockton, I began to work for CTA. I stepped out of the closet to embrace who I was personally and professionally. And for those of you who are on Facebook, and based on my husband's tags, you know I'm definitely not in the closet anymore. In 2005, I was the GR director when then-Governor Schwarzenegger broke his promise to students, tried to steal billions of dollars from public education. Remember, he called us stooges, and he put forth his so-called reform agenda of 4 anti-union initiatives. At that time, I was elected chair to the Labor and Community Coalition that was formed to stand up for workers, students, and their families. And in the most public way, we defended our core values. In one of the most expensive political battles on record, and through an incredible force of collective action and strategic mobilization, with many of you in this room, we overwhelmingly defeated every one of Arnold's initiatives. It was an amazing election night. Remember that night? It was a clean sweep for teachers, nurses, firefighters, and all working families. I get chills thinking about it. It was so exciting. And what great pleasure we all felt in 2006 when the courts ruled that Arnold illegally withheld money from public schools. And remember, the judge ruled in our favor, and the $3 billion judgment resulted in the funding of CTA's Quality Education Investment Act, a program that brought more than $3 billion in resources to schools that served primarily poor, minority, and mostly immigrant children. That's what we do at CTA. We identify the problem or the challenge, we collectively come up with a plan, and then it's all in the execution. And that's what we're doing here. We're not going to let the challenges ahead of us put our union at risk. We have a track record of responding collectively and successfully. Why would we rewrite the script now? As Eric has said, this week is a continuation of the membership engagement work we began at the President's Conference. And now I'd like to share a little more information about the facts around Fair Share. Information that we shared with local presidents defines and explains what's at stake and is available to you on the CTA website. For more than 150 years, CTA has been successfully advocating for all students, regardless of color, gender, ethnicity, language, orientation, or income. We are the most powerful, effective, student-centered, member-driven union in the nation. Our successes and years of advocacy are a direct result of our value-based mission. We believe in every child's right to a free education and a more just, equitable, democratic society. Our collective power has led us to countless successes. Our first legislative victory was establishing free schools for all students, regardless of color. It came in 1866, just 1 year after CTA was founded. Over the 3 years, there have been many, many victories. Creating the teachers' retirement system, standing up for social justice, collective bargaining, minimum school funding, and protecting educator and union rights, and the passage of multiple funding campaigns. And the more we succeed, the more we are attacked by those wanting to diminish our power, silence our collective voice, and weaken public education. But make no mistake, these attacks are politically motivated. Having not found success at the ballot box or the legislative floor, corporate special interests have now set their target on the courts. It's why we have Vergara, Friedrichs, and Bain. Although last week or 2 weeks ago, we got the Bain case thrown out on its ear for having no legal standing at all. So that brings us to Friedrichs v. CTA, filed by an Orange County teacher, Rebecca Friedrichs, is funded by the Center for Individual Rights, which in turn is funded by our favorite brothers, the Koch brothers, and other anti-union billionaires. Their game plan is pretty simple: to undermine public education by weakening the power of educators to advocate for students, ourselves, and working families. What is fair share? Really, it's a common sense solution that ensures that every worker who gets the benefit and protections of a negotiated union contract contributes to the costs of the representation that they receive. Despite what you hear from Ms. Friedrichs, no one is forced to join the union. And no fair share fees are used for political purposes. Abolishing fair share would mean some employees get benefits for free while others pay more than their fair share. As I said, this effort to have the Supreme Court ban fair share agreements isn't about the law. It's a pure political agenda. The corporate special interests want to make it harder for educators and other workers to fight for fair pay and working conditions. They want us to stop from creating an economy that works for everyone and not just the wealthy. The quality public education system we want for our students and our communities is at stake. Whether it's school funding, local bargaining, the Instructional Leadership Corps, or the CTA Institute for Teaching, a strong union equals quality education. It's why the CTA strategic plan is so important to guide us and keep us focused. And it's why our student-centered advocacy agenda helps tell our story by articulating what we believe and what we value. You know, things like a well-rounded education, access to early childhood and higher education for all students. How about smaller class sizes and educators leading our profession? Plain and simple, Friedrichs is about weakening our voice and our union. And we're not going to let that happen. We're not going to let that happen. And as we face the big money special interest behind Friedrichs or Eli Broad's latest plan to privatize half of LA schools, remember, you're the strength of CTA. It's your willingness to engage here at State Council, telling your stories, your willingness to go back to your local chapters and districts and have conversations with your colleagues that will allow us to grow distributed leadership and lead a campaign for hope and the future all students deserve. The success of our efforts depends on your local membership recruitment and engagement. The 3,000 conversations you will have and report are critical to the success of our program. In today's breakout sessions, you'll be talking about how to apply the tools Marshall gave us and that you practiced yesterday. In the face of Friedrichs, in the need to continuing funding for public education, we must use what we've learned, not just to tell our stories, but to engage in real conversations with others, to elicit their story, their values, and build relationships, and to identify, recruit, and develop more leaders and organizers within our union. And while I have to tell you I didn't realize how prophetic the chants I heard that day picking cauliflower in the 1960s would be in my life, I now fully understand their power, and I'm proud to say that I live them every day. Si se puede.